feeling pretty good about this situation. Now, after Hayne's capture, he's brought back to Charlestown. He'll be taken to the old exchange, or the building that was then the Royal Exchange and Customs House, the grand building on East Bay Street at the head of Broad. And he would be taken into that building. And this would be his final residence. The cellar area of that building, which had been used prior to the capitulation as a warehouse for the ships that were only a few feet away from the building before centuries of landfill and pushed the Cooper River back, was being used to detain prisoners. In fact, the parts of the entire building were being used by the British to detain prisoners. But specific to Hayne, writings later on do indicate that he was in what the British called their provost under the old exchange. So from a patriot in deed, Hayne becomes a patriot in need. He spent 3 weeks confined, but he had signed the oath, as many people had. And Rawdon had been out of town for quite some time. He'd been rampaging across the state. He was left in command of Camden, but he had to quit the position because of his supply lines. He pulled back to Monk's Corner. But then he had to race up to try to relieve the siege of 96. He's on his way back when Balfour contacts him and pretty much just puts his hand on the button and says, "We got one." Now, he doesn't have Marion, he doesn't have Sumter, but in Hayne, he has exactly the kind of fighter who has been causing him to pull his hair out now for many, many months. And Rawdon is coming back across the state. He's described by David Bowden, who is Hayne's primary biographer, at least to this point, as being exhausted and ill. Rawdon had bouts of some issues, but anyway, he's coming back from quite a run back and forth across the state. He gets this information, and Balfour, realizing who he has and what it could mean, indicates that he believes an example should be made of Isaac Hayne. Now, I don't know how Rawdon first reacted, but when he finally arrives back in Charlestown, he's pretty much, okay, I agree there should be an example made, and I'll be more than happy to add my name to it. Hayne is going to be brought to trial on the charge that he has broken that allegiance. Now, one thing he is going to get is a speedy trial. He was brought into Charlestown somewhere around July 8th, maybe 9th. July 26th, he was informed that a council would be held. Now, there's a couple of different ways this is presented to him, but in the end, it's going to be a council of officers, and the specific indication of that council is that they would be meeting to determine under what point of view you ought to be considered. Now, earlier Cornwallis had written a letter indicating that anyone who had borne arms with the British and then raised arms against them would be immediately hanged. But that doesn't come under this point of view, and point of view is not a very clear indication of what might be going to happen here. But Hayne would have no counsel. There's a couple of different possibilities on that. First of all, one says his lawyer couldn't be reached in the time allotted, which was one day, and others say that he just didn't feel, based on what he was told, he would need representation, which he did not get. But the next day the court met. They found him to be in violation. However, the ruling that would finally come out was not exactly from that court of inquiry, or at least not officially, because the next day, Saturday, July 28th, Rawdon Balfour issued the statement. And you can see pretty much the bullets there indicate that Hayne had signed the oath, had become what they call a subject. He definitely didn't see it that way. After he had accepted their protection, he was found in arms. He was leading a regiment. He was engaged in activities against the king. July 29th, he's informed that he would be executed for that violation on Tuesday at 6 p.m. Hayne's rights. Well, he's got a speedy trial. Now, the other part of what will later be the Sixth Amendment and some others are not going to have not been considered here. First of all, Hayne will protest. I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but Hayne basically says, I didn't know that my life was on the line. You said point of view. I didn't call witnesses. I could have a lot of people. And the next day, his lawyer, John Colcock, arrives. He finds out what's going on, and I guess he's pretty sure he's not going to get an appeal because he goes straight for dismissal. He indicates that there was no authority in Rawdon and Balfour to pass the sentence. Hayne was not informed what was going to happen. He was not a spy, and in a hearing that Colcock was not present at, he concludes that Hayne's guilt was not proven. And that's the end of Hayne's rights. Now, there were pleas for Hayne, right up to Lieutenant Governor William Bull, who's now the chief of the Board of Police, replacing Simpson, loyalists, the ladies of Charleston, and Hayne's own children came to town, at least 3 of them. Now, to show you the emotion and the times there, and this was a later writer who continued this emotion, I found this very interesting quote about what happened there at the meeting with Hayne's children and Lord Rawdon. It states that as a last effort to rescue their father from the gallows, his infant children, dressed in deep mourning and bathed in tears, were led before Lord Rawdon. Upon their knees, they addressed the monster. "Oh, our mother is dead. Spare, oh, spare our dear father." So melting was this scene that veteran soldiers wept aloud at the demoniac course of the bloodthirsty and relentless Rawdon. Now, most amazing to me in that statement is that Hayne's infant children could talk. But that's probably because they were 14, 11, and 5. And Rawdon, in most accounts, turned his back. On the other hand, in a paragraph and a half, he was called a monster, a demoniac, bloodthirsty, and relentless. So if even one of those is true, there's not going to be a chance for any plea like this, and I don't know that personally about, or haven't gained that opinion about Rawdon. But imagine Tuesday, July 31st. You're informed at 1 p.m. to ready yourself. We'll be there at 5. The schedule for the execution is scheduled at 6. Then, under the lead of Governor Bull, Hayne is given a 48-hour opportunity to address his children one final time. That turns into 2 48-hour opportunities. Now, when you visit the exchange, and most of you that will be again, go to the room on the northeast corner of the top floor. It would have been one of the customs offices originally. That room is dedicated to Colonel Hayne because on the last night of his life, he was taken to that room to meet with and say goodbye to those 3 children. His son Isaac was the 14-year-old. Sarah was 11. And the youngest of all, William Edward, was only 5. And as a fairly well-aged man, William would remember and write that he had walked through those doors with Hessians or sentinels on guard, saw his father standing in the center of the room, his father's coffin already by the window, draped in black, lined with white cloth. And in that room, Hayne said goodbye to his children. On the next day, we have a better image of that out in the lobby. Stand and look at it for a few minutes. Hayne was led away from the exchange, August 4th. He was taken to a spot just without the city lines. A crowd of thousands were out there. Parker's guide puts that spot at about the northern intersection, it appears to be northeastern intersection of Calhoun and St. Philip Streets. But just outside the city line is what is indicated. The crowd watched Hayne taken away, and of course, as he went, his friends followed closely by. And moving down the street as Hayne saw what was called the instrument of his catastrophe, one of his friends asked to speak with him, and he said that he hoped Hayne would exhibit an example of the manner in which an American can die. And the contemporary report responds that Hayne answered with utmost tranquility, "I will endeavor to do so." And on that spot, outside the city lines on August 4th, 1781, Isaac Hayne was hanged as a traitor against the king. Now, that would be reported in the Royal Gazette in Charleston, August 8th. It was a very terse indication that the British had taken care of the situation. Now, there were many incidences where this happened to people, but in Hayne it's the singularity. Numerous prisoners were held in the exchange. All of those prisoners opposed the king, but one of those prisoners, through a very specific outlined process, very methodically, was found guilty and was executed among all of them. Now, this would cause great concern on this side of the ocean and, in fact, on the other side. General Greene would become the number one or the first person to have to respond to that. There was a demand for retaliation. Now, once again, our hero, Francis Marion, is in this situation. It's already been mentioned that Greene wanted to be cautious, and of course, Marion was not a rashly wild person, but this may be one of Mr. Nealon's Robert Bass embellishments, but even if it is, I love this quote. Greene had to write Marion because he also knew that since Tories had been prominent in capturing and condemning the colonel, Marion would cut through their ranks like that of a Mohawk, would cut a path through their ranks, like that of a Mohawk. Okay, that's a pretty good image of why you would want to ask for restraint there. But in fact, the restraint was held. The question of retaliation was heavy on Greene. Not the least of his problems were American prisoners in St. Augustine, a little misdirection at the hands of Congress, and the fact that at Utah Springs, Colonel William Washington was captured, and around that same time, Governor Thomas Burke of North Carolina. So retaliating directly could have cost further action. So Greene actually never retaliated for that, but led by Isaac Mott in the Continental Congress, the South Carolina delegation, and I will say from our earlier talk, Christopher Gadsden was not the only one who asked for the head, so to speak, of Cornwallis. The South Carolina delegation proposed that Cornwallis, after his surrender at Yorktown, be hanged in retaliation for the death of Isaac Hayne. Now, across the ocean, the press got a hold of the story. The Duke of Richmond, an American sympathizer in Parliament, decided to bring an investigation on Rawdon and Balfour. Both were cleared of any direct wrongdoing. So, today we have this quote from Hayne's biographer, David Bowden. Had the British authorities executed Isaac Hayne early in the Revolution, rather than on August 4th, 1781, he might now be remembered as a patriot martyr of Nathan Hale's stature. And his own grandson, Frank Hayne, I think it's grandson, maybe a generation off here, but anyway, he, in efforts to gain recognition for Isaac Hayne, said if he'd been hanged in Boston, there'd be a monument to rival the Bunker Hill monument. I don't know if it would be quite that tall, but certainly he had a fine point. What we do have today, we have this remembrance. And this is actually an image of the hanging of Major John Andre, and some people wanted to put this Hayne's hanging on a retaliation for John Andre, who was involved in the Benedict Arnold events. But this is outside the Hayne Cemetery in Colleton County. We have this, and we have this. It has been my definite privilege to present Isaac Hayne for you today, but I want to ask Sue, you taught South Carolina history for 16 years. Do you recall if Isaac Hayne's name was even in your book?
I saw the painting yesterday, and was like, wait a minute, do I know about this? And I don't think I even knew about it.
Well, as I mentioned, we have our...
It's certainly not in that blue book that you and I talked from. You know the blue book?
Yes, I do. I absolutely do. As I mentioned, we have our general histories and our curriculum standards to tell us what we need to know, right? I will tell you, it is my privilege to be here, but the proudest work I do right now is to present this story in a shorter form to every fourth grader from Charleston and Berkeley County each school year. So perhaps, monument or not, Isaac Hayne will be better and better known. But thank you for allowing his name to be brought up here.